Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to Dr. Justina Ray of Wildlife Conservation Society Canada on why the pandemic is telling us our relationship to nature is broken. My name is Paul Babelis, and as Director of Sustainability Network, my pleasure to welcome you all here today. Sustainability Network is a 23-year-old environmental charity, and we help environmental NGOs and leaders across the country lead, manage, and strategize. I'll be the moderator for today's session. I'll introduce Justina and help out with the Q&A and wrap things up at the very end. I want to start by acknowledging that we're on the territory of the Mississaugas of the Credit and on the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, the Petun, and the Huron-Wendat. And even though this is an online event and you're at locations all over the country, just encourage you all to take a moment to reflect and pause and reflect and acknowledge the territory that you are currently on. A reminder that a recording of the webinar and the slides will be made available to all who registered. We've got a good crowd of over 60 people expected today, and a veritable who's who of the conservation, NGO, and environmental law community. So folks from CPAWS Yukon, Wildlife Conservation Society, Birds Canada, Nature Conservancy, Nature Canada, Nature Alberta, Conservation Ontario, Canopy and Greenpeace, and from the law community, CELA Eco-Justice, and the Environmental Law Centre of Alberta. So great crowd and a great level of experience and knowledge in the Zoom room today. You'll be muted throughout the call, but we do want to get your questions. Please put them in the Q&A box, the Zoom function there. Submit them as they come to you. It's always a bit chaotic if everything comes in once the presentation is over. But once Justina's finished up her presentation, I will kind of pose those questions to her. So as mentioned, please submit them in the Q&A function, and we'll get to them after the presentation. Dr. Justina Ray is President and Senior Scientist at Wildlife Conservation Society Canada since its incorporation 16 years ago. She's involved in research and policy activities associated with conservation-based planning, environmental assessment, biodiversity conservation, with a particular focus on wildlife and northern boreal landscapes. She's been appointed to numerous government advisory panels and is adjunct professor at both the U of T and Trent. Over to you, Justina.
Great, thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me, and thank you so much for taking time in your day for this. And I'm also on the same land that Paul is, and very grateful to be able to share it at this time in particular. So I'll start on the slides right away and just start by saying that, of course, most of us are now focusing almost entirely, and that the larger conversation is happening almost entirely on the symptoms of the problem. We're on the public health side, we're carefully documenting the case spread as it happens, listening to public health officials, and that's sort of what the broader population is preoccupied quite suitably. But what I'm here today to talk about is really about the causes. We need to better understand the risk and so forth, because most of our recovery will be determined by that kind of understanding. And given that a single zoonotic outbreak can have such devastating economic and social impacts, prevention is, of course, much more cost-effective than any response. So I'm going to focus on that environmental side of the zoonotic dimension of the disease, and explore a little bit about what came before this. What does it say about our relationship with nature? And I'm going to go through this in 4 parts. I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about the emergence, the relationship between disease emergence and environmental degradation in particular. It is a global story, and a lot of this comes from very far away, but I'm going to come to the focus on Canada and what this means for us, and responses and solutions at a variety of scales. So that's what I'm going to do, and hopefully that works for everybody. The perspective that I bring today is really as a wildlife ecologist. I'm not an epidemiologist. I'm not a wildlife health specialist, but active in biodiversity science and policy. I'm also a field scientist, or have been. And I've done quite a bit of field work in Central Africa and Asia as well as North America, including even sampling rodents for viruses back in the day, including Ebola. And I'm also very privileged to be part of a larger network of WCS scientists and epidemiologists. We are the only large conservation organization in the world that actually has an embedded wildlife health program. And in fact, a number of these slides come from Doctors Chris Walzer and Sarah Olson from Wildlife Health, and with whom we are in constant touch. And it feels very privileged to be coming from that kind of perspective. It is important as a scientist to talk about the fact that the science itself is growing at breathtaking speed. If you just look at the number of publications that have been published this year, it's a crazy amount, and it's escalating. Canada is actually the sixth most prolific publisher of COVID-19 research, with over 2,000 articles already. University of Toronto is the fifth most prolific university, behind two in US, UK, and also China. But in an op-ed in the Globe this weekend, Timothy Caulfield made the point that as exciting as these trends are, there is a dangerous side. The public is essentially watching the sausage making of COVID science. Of course, a lot of it is really focused on the clinical side, not on the stuff that I'm going to be talking to you today, but the same trends are apparent. And ultimately, this sausage making viewpoint could have a negative impact on people's perception of scientists, especially among those in the public with little or no scientific education, because it feels like people are changing their mind, but really this is just sort of taking off and exploring. And that's really important context to think about as we tell the story. Just to start with a primer on infectious diseases, the zoonoses are what we're talking about, and these are diseases that move between animals and humans. And they actually can move both ways, but we're really thinking about those that move from animals to humans in this story. Most emerging infectious diseases, sort of novel diseases that kind of show up, are zoonoses. They originated in wildlife. And 72% of those originated in wildlife. Sorry, are zoonoses, they originate from any kind of animal, and 72% of those originated in wildlife as opposed to domestic livestock. And most of the described zoonoses happen indirectly via the food system. So we don't necessarily catch them from the host animals themselves, but they happen through a process and often through the food system. There's a phenomenon called spillover, which happens when the virus actually that is naturally present in a host species is transmitted. That actual spillover is a great mystery in terms of when it and how it happens, but always important for us to understand. Often we don't understand it until retrospectively. There's a lot we're understanding about this virus in kind of the immediate term, which is quite extraordinary. But a lot of these stories don't get formed until way after they've happened. And this kind of emergent infectious disease outbreak is happening more and more frequently. And a lot of diseases that we're aware of, from HIV, Ebola, H1N1, SARS, those are zoonoses that emerged in different ways, but the phenomenon is very similar with all of these. And here's just sort of a kind of a view of, like, if we look at the timeline between 1900, we see that these events are happening with much more frequency. Some of them are more dangerous than others. Some of them just sort of keep reappearing. So these are when they first appeared, but some of them keep reappearing. And some of them are quite surprised. So Zika and MERS viruses really happened by significant surprises. Others have been more, predictable. That a lot of these. Maybe not in their exact way, but the phenomenon of these disease outbreaks have been predicted, are logical in their occurrence. But there has definitely been an increasing rate of these emergence over the last 5 decades. So if we look at this paper, is sort of, if you look at it kind of looks at the timeline just in a very specific period between November of last year and January, where the story became familiar. And don't worry about all the little writing. You can study it later if you want to. But really, the take-home message here is that the number of cases on the y-axis, and then we're talking about timeline on the x-axis. And the pneumonia of some sort first emerged in November in Wuhan. By the end of December, there were already a cluster of cases. And by December 30th, it's when the Chinese government notified the WHO. And of 425 initial cases, 55% of them were linked to a so-called wet market, which is the wildlife trade section of the particular market in Wuhan. So the diagnosis and direction of the coronavirus happened with remarkable speed, starting with a public sharing of the gene sequence. So, by Chinese authorities, and the completed PCR diagnostic reagent was developed in January, right around the time the first reported case came outside China. So the timing of the emergence then coincided with the Chinese New Year and movements of massive numbers of people, which certainly helped facilitate the spread. So that, many of you are familiar with that, but that just gives you sort of in a nutshell how much happened at that particular critical moment. And it all sort of relates to this particular kind of scenario where the initial spark of the pandemic in wildlife markets. My WCS colleague, Dr. Walzer, calls these cauldrons of contagion. These are special and play an important potential role in this story. So animals in Chinese markets are generally alive, they having been caught either in the region or transported from far away. They've got 50 to 100 species on top of each other in cages. You add domestic species to the mix, you've got customers, thousands of people. Often this is happening indoors. These wild animals are in high stress. They're secreting all sorts of things, different species on top of another who would never meet each other in natural conditions. And this is a phenomenal opportunity for the shedding of viral particles. And they're also slaughtered on site. And so wildlife markets such as these they stimulate many of these sort of novel and unique opportunities for viruses to exchange. And since wildlife markets were in fact proven to be the source of the SARS 2002 outbreak, they were found in civets waiting to be eaten in a restaurant. So that is clear. The discovery really happened later. But in this case, we don't have kind of that smoking gun, because once the situation was understood, the Wuhan market was immediately cleared out and no testing was done of any of the wildlife in there. They did take 500 samples of the environment, 33 of which were positive. And of these 33, 31 were in the Western market, which was where wildlife is housed. This is a strong signal, but not absolute proof. But a lot of things come to this. And in spite of the relative certainty at this stage, the origin has become a bit of a political powder keg, source of many conspiracy theories. There is a two-person team that just went to China from WHO, an epidemiologist and a wildlife health and animal health expert. They just came for an initial mission to prepare for a larger international mission later this year. But this is the kind of dialogue that is occurring, and very, very importantly. The viral discovery, preceding this time, particularly in the last decade, there's been tons of, attention paid to sampling animals and markets and people, particularly around Southeast Asia. So concerted surveillance methods, and also in Africa. And many, the discoveries are that many viruses exist in wildlife, and that most of them don't cause any harm to their natural hosts, and they're only making trouble for us when they manage to jump over to human beings or other creatures with which they don't share long evolutionary histories. And so of about 700,000 high-risk viruses, we only understand less than 0.1%, so a fraction of them. And we do understand, though, that certain taxa tend to have lots of viruses, especially those species groups that are themselves really diverse, and particularly things like bats and rodents. And lots of investigation has gone, why are there so many viruses in these animals? And really the only explanation is that there just are a ton of species in those taxonomic groups. There has been some talk about snakes and pangolins and so forth. And although there's small genomic bits of this type of virus in snakes, in pangolins, there's absolutely no evidence of any in snakes. There is the curious situation about a Wuhan lab working on coronaviruses right in that area. So lots of conspiracy theories about lab escape, but then analysis showed that this is something that cannot be bioengineered, and a lab escape scenario is untenable with reality. So the wildlife markets are really is where everybody is pointing to in this circumstance. So we do know the wildlife source of our SARS, but there's still knowledge gaps. We know that the evolutionary source is bats, and we do know that they also were in some of the other coronaviruses that have emerged. But in both cases that we do know also that they came as an intermediary between other species. So MERS, the unlikely intermediary, was dromedary camels, and as I said already, with the SARS 20 years ago, it was civets. And so and bats are the original, but we don't know at this point how it got from bats to humans. There was a report just last week by UNEP, the United Nations Environmental Program, a very seminal report that sort of outlines the cause of these pandemics, and does a fantastic job on sort of parsing out the various explanations, the story that I'm telling you here, and makes a number of very concrete points about how the frequency of pathogen organisms jumping from animals to people is increasing, but that it's really about unsustainable human activities, and these outbreaks are predictable and predicted, and they all are about how people source and grow food, trade and consume animals, and alter environments. And they talk about these sort of 7 human-mediated factors that range from sort of increased human demand for animal protein, unsustainable agricultural intensification, and natural resource exploitation, increased travel and transportation, changes in food supply, changes in land use, and climate change. The closer humans are to animals, the greater the likelihood of interactions between them that really aren't supposed to happen naturally at such frequency, and then be amplified in a way that brings them into markets and into urban areas in a way that never happened in this kind of intensity just a decade or so ago. So there's greater and greater opportunities for zoonotic spillover. And that's a simple story. And this really underscores the reality why it really doesn't matter whether it originated, who it originated from, and how it got there. I mean, certainly, in the sense of which animal, and whether it's pangolin soup or bats or what. It really is about this kind of interface, and the interface is really the critical thing. And markets, of course, I've already talked about these ridiculously unnatural situations that have escalated in recent time. And the wildlife trade has fostered these markets. They're an ecological aberration. They bring in wildlife animals into urban markets, often for consumption. And data are showing clearly again and again that no matter what city, the main reason that people are consuming these animals in the cities really has to do with taste and tradition. It is seldom about subsistence. So a lot of we're talking about these larger urban markets where this is most likely to occur and these opportunities are. And wildlife trade, which is facilitating this, is the 4th largest illegal trade in the world behind drugs, humans, and weapons. A 2017 study showed that meat consumption in China has increased by 1/3 since 2000, and more rapidly than any other major economy. And the demand for wildlife products of all kinds has surged, and exotic meat has appeal in the West as well. Many thousands of pounds of bushmeat make their way to Europe and North America every year. Many major cities have clandestine bushmeat markets in them. They're very small, behind the scenes, but this is just to tell you a little bit about demand. But degradation is the spark. This is where the interface occurs, where the animals are removed from their habitat, but also where particular land use changes that we incur, fragmentation of habitats and so forth, make those interfaces so much more real. Roads through intact habitats. And it's just the unprecedented growth of our species that's radically altered the abundance of and distribution of other animals. We've now modified more than 70% of the globe, or the ice-free part of it at any rate. And more than a third of the forest globally is gone, in the face of agriculture. But we also, and this is a report that we wrote fairly recently that you can get from our website, and there's other materials like that really talk specifically about that link. The mechanisms are not always clear from one situation to another, but the relationships are between degradation and these events and the interfaces is quite understandable, and more research is emerging to that effect. Last year, we were all sort of taken on our heels by the IPBES report, and IPBES is, of course, the acronym for the International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, and that's the analog to the IPCC that we know and are much more familiar with. Those are the experts that come together every 5 or so years to tell us what's going on with the climate. Well, that hadn't really happened with biodiversity and ecosystem services, and the IPBES panel was struck quite a bit later than IPCC, and they came out with their first larger assessment last year. And the tale that they told was staggering. I've got the bullet points there. You can read them yourselves, and most of you are familiar with that because the headlines were extraordinary. And although it was a global assessment, there are a lot of these same patterns that were depicted in the report are evident in Canada that are less bombshell type, dramatic stories, but more about degradation that do have their impact, and we are seeing that. I mean, we devastate wildlife, we eliminate entire species. That's we, the broader global we, but at the same time, we squeeze those that are left into small spaces and to really unnatural situations. And that's where we start to jeopardize our own health. And a few species have proliferated. They do very, very well with us. And those are often host species. And they thrive in and around our homes, and they can host these sort of pathogens. And so the IPBES is really talking about this increasingly as sort of the relationship. And the report last year was also seminal in terms of really explaining and charting out the direct relationship between biodiversity decline and human well-being. And the health situation that I'm talking about is obviously just one part of that. So these spillover events, like, how do they happen? I mean, there's a little bit of a different story in every event. I'm not going to go into this so much. This graphic is just to show you that it's somewhat complex, of course. But by and large, they happen time and again in these disrupted landscapes, and at this so-called interface. And I'll tell you two stories that sort of show it classically, and they both of them relate to bats as the original host, and they usually begin when a human takes a bat somewhere that it would never go on its own, or when humans intrude into the home. And the Nipah virus is a prime example. And this sparked in Indonesia and Malaysia, and where wild fruit trees are less productive than usual because of a bunch of fires and other types of land degradation events. So bats started coming more and more into the orchards of people and farms and start feeding fallen fruit. And they come into contact with pig farmers. And by 1999, just a few years after all this forest clearing and fire and so forth had happened, already 265 people had died. They developed severe brain inflammation, and it was the first known emergence of Nipah virus in people, and it's caused a string of significant recurrent outbreaks. None of them are ever like this is not a virus that is then gone to human transmission, but it is these events that have occurred over time and place just sort of keep happening, and never each one of them newsworthy enough, but of course in whatever the word, accumulation. So it's one of the many infectious diseases that's usually confined to wildlife that have spilled over to people in areas undergoing rapid forest clearing. And that's a tropical story, but closer to home, our most famous story is Lyme disease, and again, sort of an insidious creep of a problem that's magnified over time. And that's also been occurred by deforestation and fragmentation, and mostly the nexus was in the Northeast United States. And the bacterium that cause Lyme disease is transmitted by ticks that rely on forest-dwelling deer to breed and obtain enough blood to survive. But the bacterium is also found in white-footed mice, and these are some of the most prolific and common, small rodents, and they do beautifully in human modified habitats, and they displace other sort of more forest specific forest dwelling rodents, mice and so forth. They're omnivorous, they're adaptable, and expanding human populations over this time, providing fragmenting forests in particular have have created these like islands of green, and in these fragments where many creatures can't survive, white-footed mice have thrived, and they infect. They come in then into contact with ticks, and that's the vehicle. That's essentially the vehicle that then cause Lyme disease, and that's been an increasing risk. And of course, that's come into Canada, and where whitefoot mice tend to be in fragments where they're more constrained by competitors and so forth, there is some evidence to suggest that the disease and the proliferation to Lyme disease will be less, to ticks and so forth will be, the spillover events are less likely to occur. The most abundant species are the best hosts for these pathogens. In Canada, the reported number of diseases has increased from 144 cases in 2009 to over 2,000 in 200 to 2017. Sorry. Interestingly, though, with all this, we have to put some of things in perspective. Spillover events happen all the time, but they're not. It takes a lot for something to actually become as really severe and particularly to get to pandemic proportions. Diseases can emerge from these creation of interfaces. They create more opportunities for contact, but most of them result in dead-end spillover events in which the pathogen is transmitted from the animal reservoir to a human, but is unable to achieve really any kind of sustained transmission, let alone human-to-human transmission. And ultimately, to be a pandemic, you really have to have virulent human-to-human transmission, and most of the diseases don't get to that stage. And so there are a lot of biological features, which I won't get into, that seemingly determine the likelihood of that human transmissibility. Some of it is that vector-borne diseases don't tend to do that. But in turn, this is something that we do need to keep perspective over. And don't worry about all of the sort of small print here, except to sort of this graphic kind of shows that there's so many barriers and everything's kind of got to line up. And all these factors have to line up in various stages of the progression. And if any of these is impenetrable, spillover can't occur ultimately. So, and understanding this requires sort of a transdisciplinary kind of mindset. But that's for the reason why this doesn't happen all the time. And but we create more and more opportunities, so it's kind of a roll of the dice. North America is not a global hotspot of risk in the zoonotic disease emergence. These yellow spots are really where these are most likely to happen, and they have to have a set of ingredients that accentuate the risk. And all of them I've already told you about. But you have to have sort of significant land conversion, creation of these habitat edges, but then these movement of animals through trade and consumption, agricultural intensification, all of those things, and in high biodiverse environments where you have more species, higher likelihood, more virus, more opportunities. And so these are where really these yellow places on the map where the likely spark of the major risk is most to happen. And they don't tend to be in North America. But we're not out of any woods at all, because we have a number of major zoonotic diseases already of public health importance. That rate of emergence has increased markedly since the 1940s. They come here or they emerge from a variety of different ways. But you know, most of them don't originate here necessarily, so they're not and they're not pandemic threats. And you know, this importing from internationally through international movements and so forth is an issue. But they're accumulating in problem, and we kind of deal with them one disease at a time. But when we look at them in sum, you know, this is an accumulated problem. We also have a number of major wildlife diseases as well, and this just on the left is just as sort of a list of ones that have kind of are all over Canada, but there are many that are much more regionally important, and this is also an outdated list over 10 years old. And you know, some of them are becoming more concerning. I mean, the chronic wasting disease has emerged, and this is a disease that so far is only evident in deer. Hasn't come into Canada in a big way, but it's what's called a prion, and this is a modified protein with the ability to transmit their misfolded shape into normal variants of the same into the brain and cause neurodegenerative disorders. So this is sort of the same ilk as like mad cow disease and so forth. So although there's no direct evidence that CWD can be transmitted to humans, there's the fear of that. Nobody can say for sure. So there's enormous attention to trying to stave this off. There's also major concern that this can hit endangered caribou populations. So these kind of diseases are of concern for both humans and wildlife. And you know, then we've got the livestock diseases as well. So all of these are here and of concern. And of course, a changing climate and you know, the introduction of pathogens from far away, particularly vector-borne pathogens, are you know, a reality that is spreading. You know, we have these novel diseases that come in through that fashion. So in terms of the global response, it's, you know, it's all got to be focused on preventing the next pandemic. And I should say that the UNEP report, as good as it was in explaining, you know, sort of how it all came about, what the risks are and so forth, most you know, people in the conservation community feel like that didn't, the solutions there were not strong enough. And in particular, there's been a significant call out to permanently ban the commercial trade in wildlife for consumption. You know, there's a lot of reasons to do it in any case, and the dialogue now by many people, including quite a few of the countries in question, is really to go for a permanent ban. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. And then also just sort of strengthening efforts to combat trafficking of wild animals. I mean, some of that is legal, but quite a bit of it is illegal, as I talked about before. And then working to change dangerous wildlife consumption behaviors, but really most focused on cities, as I explained previously. There's also got to be, there also is a targeted sort of thrust to have development aid by developed countries, particularly in Europe and US, really look at risk reduction. So making sure that the aid that doesn't exacerbate the problem. And you know, particularly when we're talking about like major development projects, natural resources development and so forth. Then there's the kind of mainstreaming of One Health approaches. I'll talk about that in a second. And then really trying to stem the tide of ecosystem degradation and preserve intact habitats, intact ecosystems, really to value intactness, because more and more as they're diminishing, we understand their value more and more. Just a few words about banning the commercial trade. There is a lot of talk about that. I'm not going to go into it too much, but you know, WCS has issued a position paper on this. So have many of our colleagues. It was done in late March with a firm, you know, firm on stopping wildlife trade for consumption and these markets. And the markets have been a destructive force in the trade for a lot of other reasons, ranging from pets to medicine and so forth. So, you know, there's a lot of other reasons for this. And China is working towards a dramatic change in their laws. And you know, that will play out. You know, it's taking a few months. There's an enormous public interest in the country in doing so. It's helpful to think about that in the SARS outbreak, the wildlife markets were closed immediately, but they opened fairly soon after the threat disappeared, after the disease kind of effectively disappeared, and they reopened, and it was business as usual and has ramped up since then. So many are really keen not to repeat those that same pattern, and so that's a really important aspect. Then a more nuanced approach is required in Africa, and it's really about more by where wild meat is consumed for both subsistence and in cities, and from moving from local communities into the cities, and because there's such a preference and there's such an urban demand that has emptied the forests, it's compromised sustainable use in the local communities and so forth. And so there's a little bit more of a nuanced approach there, looking at behavioral change, which is having some early success and will be a long game. I mentioned One Health, and many of you would be familiar with that. And they just happened to be reinvigorated, and WCS and the German government and other partners and a number of Canadians were gathered in Berlin in the fall, little knowing what was about to be on the doorstep, but really reaffirming these kind of One Health principles. And the notion is that to unite in a much more integrated fashion medical, veterinarian, environmental, and socio-ecological expertise much more deliberately, and thinking about them in an integrated fashion, because these disciplines tend to be siloed, the governance tends to be siloed, and so on. And this has got to become central to pretty much any response to the pandemic moving forward. Is this One Health approach, which is also called sometimes eco-health, planetary bound health, a number of other names have been, but the WHO has adopted this, CDC in the States, and so on. But how much of this is relevant for Canada? Not all global responses are relevant. I mean, we don't have the trade in anywhere near this kind of a situation. I mean, in fact, we had our significant wildlife trade issues about 100 years ago. The Migratory Bird Treaty is one way in which the trade issues were resolved, also Pribilof seals and so forth, very early on, when there were marked declines in wildlife back in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so that trade right here is not at all the situation. Also, commercial consumption of wildlife is highly regulated, and once you start looking into the rules and regs for that, it's a very different situation. We do have significant issues that we've been hearing about with industrial food animal production, and it's definitely a growing risk. This has happened in North America in many cities, resulting in these sort of industrial scale operations with high densities of confined animal populations, and any kind of is particularly pigs and poultry. And so we're talking about bird hosts coming and interacting with farmed animals and so on, and a lot of the same issues that have come up in concern related to just the human the human toll related to the COVID crisis and looking at industrial food production, that carries with it risks for this story as well. And we also have to invest more than we do in wildlife and disease health surveillance. These are the canary in the coal mine, so to speak. The One Health approach needs to be more deliberate, and I'll talk about that in a second as it relates to Canada. And then mostly it's about preventing exacerbation of impacts. Some of these are coming no matter what, through introduction of pathogens. That's a lot of where disease happened. Climate is going to make this worse. But there's other things that we can do in terms of taking care of our land use change, this piecemeal development that we tend to do, cumulative impacts that nobody watches very carefully, the basin opening roads that come in, and so on. So those are things that all have bearing on human health as we understand the relationship between environmental degradation, biodiversity decline, and human well-being, as I talked about previously. Not all of you may know that there is a Pan-Canadian Wildlife Health Framework, and it was developed with all the ministers responsible for biodiversity and conservation at the highest levels, and this framework was approved in 2018. It does deliberately adopt a One Health approach. It recognizes that the current approach has been sort of this disease by disease reactive sort of situation. It recognizes the fragmented governance that we enjoy here in Canada. It talks about trying to be much more proactive rather than reactive, focusing on preparedness, surveillance, and much more integration. And you know, it's this canary in the coal mine notion of wildlife health that helps us identify these threats, these stresses that are happening, and they may not in and of themselves be very severe when they first emerge. But you know, all of them come together. We're kind of in this insidious, slow-moving sort of situation. We don't have these big dramatic things that are happening elsewhere in the world, but we do have stuff that's happening that we need to watch carefully and deal with and be much more preventive about. You know, the problem with our whole federation is that we are already really siloed in this domain. We are not equipped to do the One Health very well, as most of you would totally know. Not only is health embedded within ministries, doesn't have legislation to itself, wildlife health and so on, but it's fragmented across. Each province has its own kind of level of capacity, its own strategy, its own set of rules and regulations and so on. It's definitely the responsibility, as wildlife is, of the provinces. So the notion of coordination, which everybody embraces, is a real heavy lift and it will require resources. So that's a bit of a reality check. And there has been no obvious movement on this framework in terms of funding and so on since 2018. I should also take the opportunity to say that most NGOs aren't really playing in this space. They're not, you know, it is a very kind of specialized area that's more focused on kind of the wildlife, you know, which is more hunting and fishing and so forth. And it's and this needs to be elevated if we're able to sort of resolve the biodiversity or tackle the biodiversity crisis. We need to bring this dimension in. We do have a strong community of practice. So just a bit of a shout out to a group called the Environment, Community and Health Observatory. That's you know, mostly from University of British Columbia, University of Northern British Columbia, but several others as well. And this is adopting deliberately the One Health approach in civil society, and so this is something that can really be an excellent model. I want to end this by talking about sort of two kind of unforeseen and unintended consequences and worries that I have, that we have and we should have about how this is all playing out. And one is just sort of the unfortunate consequence that all this has on blowback on bats, which already suffer from bad reputations. They're a fairly diverse species group in Canada. We have many species, and you know, in some places, as like British Columbia, we have as many as 20 species, and there's a lot of you know, already bad, you know, difficult attitudes towards bats, especially when the disease, when it emerged that this was, they were so-called responsible for the emergence of the SARS virus 20 years ago. So to be clear, bats themselves cannot directly transmit this coronavirus, including COVID, to humans. They do naturally have very many viruses, but they're also a remarkable fact that they don't tend to be impacted. So the secret for this is probably lies within bats as to how they cope with all these viruses. And again, it's just because they are so many species themselves. Getting rid of them altogether is no solution, because you know, they could probably, for a variety of reasons, make the problem worse. But more importantly, they have critical ecosystem services as insect eaters, pollinators, seed dispersal. They're already suffering from declines, having experienced staggering impacts from white nose syndrome, which is in and of itself a pathogen, a fungal pathogen that came from Europe about 14 years ago and has had devastating impacts. Fundamentally, the ultimate enemy is not bats, it's us. But secondly, we have to be mindful of implications for Indigenous food security on this story that's emerging. And one of the things is that when a lot of the international dialogue has been, stopping wildlife consumption and related to the trade and so forth, it's very tailored to these hot spots that I've been talking about. But some of that rhetoric can come back and blow back as well. And it's not to say that there's absolutely no risk, but we do have vibrant subsistence economies that are trying really quite deliberately to stay away from expensive, unsustainable, unhealthy processed food that gets flown in. And so the food security dimension of this is very important to pay attention to, but also the fact that these are the eyes and ears on the ground. And while there are issues that we have to be concerned about, there are zoonoses in the Arctic and boreal environments, in particular, where we're talking about here. Um, eyes on the ground, another great reason for Guardians programs, but also just super vigilance and training of hunters and youth in wildlife health monitoring and so on. Some of this is happening in a terrific way in places, but I just wanted to make sure that we don't overlook that. And I think that's all I have to say for the moment, and can entertain any questions. Meantime, if you want to contact me directly with anything, that's my email there. Follow us on any of our social media. And I really appreciate this opportunity. I hope it was somewhat useful and interesting. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Justina. So we'll get to the questions in a second, but this is an opportunity for you to take a deep breath, a bit of a breather. You've been on the hot seat for a while, but we have had a number of questions. So the first one actually combines a couple, and I'm hoping it's a bit of a softball. But it's looking at sort of preventative actions and what's going on three levels. So locally, where you have maybe public health units and wildlife agencies, environmental agencies. I mean, what are the implications there? Provincially, maybe more of a policy focus, and then sort of federally or cross country. A few people have mentioned a real interest in One World, One Health, and that sort of collaboration with Canadian Public Health Association, et cetera. So just kind of looking at what things should be done, can be done on three levels.
So maybe I'll start from the top, and I did cover some of this, but this provides a little bit more opportunity. I mean, so at the federal level, the intent is there, that Pan-Canadian approach, although it doesn't go all the way in some ways because there aren't all the resources in the world, but it does promote a One Health approach, or start to. But to be quite honest, there's a lot that has to happen just in coordinating wildlife health in and of itself. So I would say that not many people are paying attention to it. So we need to, as those involved in civil society, need to promote the approach a bit more, promote the One Health approach, and make a case for why this has to occur in Canada more deliberately, a marriage between public health and so on, and wildlife health, livestock, agriculture, and so forth. Being splintered into all of these jurisdictions and within them all of these ministries is very difficult, and it provides barriers to all of this. So I think the role of civil society is important to in that equation. I will say that there is some integrated work on climate. So physicians acknowledging that the environment is so important for human health, but it's very specific to climate, and it would be good to expand that bubble into biodiversity. It's easy to do, and then that would promote them, make the whole sort of notion of the One Health a bit more understandable, if that's the word that it's just the first word that came to my mouth. So at the provincial level, it is a dog's breakfast out there. If you go to each website and sort of look at how health is being dealt with, it depends a lot on the sort of individual capacity. There's some provinces that have a terrific capacity and individuals who are very visionary, and some where the capacity just isn't there, and it's sort of embedded and hidden and very reactive. On some diseases, we've done a lot of investment. So Ontario is a great example. There's quite a lot going on rabies, specifically on surveillance and and so on, and has been quite effective for that particular disease, but it's not being undertaken with a larger integrated approach that that would demand, and it's really a very disease-specific approach. You know, a lot of resources were diverted to the CWD problem, the chronic wasting disease, because of the unknown and potentially devastating impacts to humans, you know, because of these sort of these neurodegenerative diseases that are very scary. And I think at the local scale, being more cognizant of all this, and depending on what people do, I mean, surveillance is really important. Again, I think this is just another reason for bolstering guardians and any kind of community-based monitoring. There's just more reason for it as governments are doing less monitoring, and they're not necessarily, you know, even if they step up on wildlife health monitoring, there's not much population-based monitoring going on where we can signal problems in particular animals, and so on. And so I think the monitoring and surveillance is really important. And then the age-old issue that we deal with respect to land use change and so forth. So none of these are actually new things that we don't already want to have happen or already need to happen for other reasons. And so I guess it's really about trying to bring the human health angle in there more without inflating it. We're not going to spark the chances of us sparking a pandemic here. I tried to make that clear. We don't have those ingredients that exist elsewhere. You know, you can't go too far with that argument, but we do have this slow-moving crisis that's going to get worse with more human transference back and forth, and all these trends that have been accelerating, and plus climate. So we have to be very careful about paying attention to exacerbating the issue.
Great, thank you very much. A couple minutes ago, you mentioned sort of resources and sometimes, you know, linked to human impact. So we had one question that kind of went into that, and she was wondering if there's a potential for public health spending akin to what the UK has done with the National Health Service spending on green spaces to promote health and well-being.
Yeah, I mean, I think that Europe is way ahead of us on a lot of this stuff. There's some interesting things coming out there, and I appreciate the questioner. The questioner, is that a word? It is now. For raising that, and it does. Yes, I mean, the simple answer is yes. I mean, we can't always notice it, but we are directly affected, directly and indirectly affected by this slow-moving situation, and not just on just on well-being in general. I mean, I think that's the best way I can answer that question, is just to be, you know, enthusiastically yes.
Okay, so I've got one question left. So, but please don't hesitate to you know, go into the Q&A, pull down the Zoom function and put something in. We have time for at least a couple more. And this question stems from, I mean, he mentions Lyme disease, rabies, H1N1, and how traditionally public health has been focused on treatment and prevention of exposure. But are there nature-based approaches to reduce the risk of these diseases to both wildlife and humans?
Yeah, I mean, so I've said almost the limit to my expertise already, and in fact, we need to work more on that, and the broader we on those kind of questions. But it's very hard. It takes a lot of detective work, and it's very difficult to sort of figure out that what's going on at that interface. We know, broadly speaking, and it's logical based on patterns and everything that has been happening retrospectively, that somewhere, you know, that interface is either sparking or exacerbating the problem. But you can't, you know, to put that into a particular individual decision, like, if you do this, then you'll have more rabies, is completely impossible. It's more about a larger pattern, but we suffer from that from a policy perspective on a variety of things. We just know that the overall pattern of fragmentation and land use changes that are happening and the decision-making patterns are bad, and they're just, you know, somewhere down the line they're causing the slow-moving crisis, and we can't do a heck of a lot more than that. short of researching every problem, which is not going to be possible. And so all I can say again is that, you know, coming from a wildlife ecology perspective and not an epidemiologist, is that those patterns of change have to be rectified and brought into bear with the sort of the knowledge that they have ramifications on human well-being in a variety of ways that we're only beginning to understand. And you can't find a smoking gun on this. And even in the hot spots, it's very difficult to do that, as much as people are trying. And so we have to be looking at the broader patterns of behavior more deliberately. I hope that helps, but I feel like I'm repeating myself a wee bit.
Okay. Final question, and it relates to the global map of zoonotic diseases. And there was pockets in West Africa and Central Europe. Can you comment on what is happening in those areas and how they're similar or different from Asia?
Yeah, Central Africa is very easy to do. I mean, those have some of the same patterns, but not as expansive, in the sense that, you know, much of the disease outbreaks have been more relatively localized. And while there are wildlife markets in urban centers, they're not of the magnitude that that the big yellow spot in Asia has shown. I mean, those are, you know, we're talking about enormous population concentrations in those areas, huge urban centers multiplied on top of each other, and huge demand. And so that's where the epicenter of all trade is, and that's the epicenter where a lot of the destination of these and then the proliferation of these markets occurs. In Central Africa, it's a less magnitude, but the same patterns are there. Certainly, you've got high biodiversity in these areas, and you've got significant you know, and you've got trade occurring. You've got movement of animals outside. I mean, what they say is that, you know, Ebola, you know, would have been there, probably some aspect of that would have, something like that would have spilled over many times way back when, but they're always kind of localized, and they might as bad as they are, they might have a few deaths. But if you add on top of that all the movement that's happening, and the direct the direct human movement, once the interface spillover has occurred, then the problem gets magnified so much more. And that's why these Ebola outbreaks keep happening. And some of them are getting larger and more difficult to extinguish just because of the large number of people. I actually cannot tell you offhand what the Central Europe situation is. And I'll have to go back and look at that. I was mostly focused, and I did notice that, and then I forgot to go look at that directly in the paper, or if I did, I've kind of forgotten. So I can share, if the questioner is interested in finding out that paper, I can have a discussion offline. And I'd be happy to do that. And basically that analysis was done with sort of factors that tend to be important that you can also map. And of course, there's issues associated with that, because they're not all, when you ground truth them, sometimes aberrations do appear in data like that. But in this case, I think the patterns are overall are all quite good.
Excellent, Justina. Well, so let's wrap things up, and yeah, a sincere thanks to making your time available, sharing this kind of knowledge, which few of us have. So, you know, on behalf of all the people on the call, appreciate that. I wish we could kind of open you up to more sort of mass media opportunities, because there's a lot of this that needs to be much more widely known. You'll get everyone who signed up will get a copy of the slides, as well as a link to a recording, probably by end of day. You'll also get our event blasts. If you signed up for this, you wind up on our database. We actually sent out just a couple hours ago next week's webinar, which brings together Nature Canada, NRDC, and Environmental Defense on the logging loophole. And I'll leave it there to tempt you to visit the site and find out more details and sign up for that. When we shut down here, you'll get a sort of a feedback form pop up, and really appreciate it if you just take a minute or so to answer those very few questions to give us a bit of thoughts on how you found today's session. And finally, thanks to you all for turning out. Hope to see you all again soon. Stay safe and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks very much.